If you're a fan of award-winning books, and if you're a fan of ranking those award-winning books, and you just enjoy knowing what the really smart literary people out there are thinking these days, if so, then today's video just might be for you. Today, I will be ranking all 19 of the Pulitzer Prize finalists and winners for the 2025 Pulitzer Prize Book Awards. Welcome to Spencer Reads Everything. I'm your host, Spencer Duncan, and on this channel, I read everything. Hence the name, whether it is epic fantasy or nonfiction or young adult novels, whatever interests me and whatever I think might interest you, I give it a try and then I let you guys know what I think about it. Now, those of you that have been longtime viewers of this channel, you know that I am a big fan of the Pulitzer Prizes. There are 6 book categories. Let me make sure I get all of them right. You have the 2 that are fiction or not quite nonfiction. Of course, one is just called the fiction category, and then the other one would be poetry. As you can see, that'd be somewhere in between. And then you have your 4 nonfiction categories, which are, of course, biography, autobiography slash memoir. That one is the newest one and one that I have interesting thoughts on. Then you have history, and then you have general nonfiction. So those are 6 categories. Usually there are 2 finalists and a winner. Sometimes things are, for a variety of reasons, going to be a little different. Sometimes they actually have 3 finalists and 1 winner. Sometimes they have 2 winners and only 1 additional finalist. It all depends. This year, we only had 1 major exception that I can think of, and that, of course, was in the fiction category. It actually had 1 winner, a standout winner, and then 3 other finalists. So this is where I tell you, after I've already had my initial reaction to each of these books, you can go see my initial reaction once the 2025 list of winners and finalists came out, or you can go watch each of my videos. I have done a video for all 19 of these books at this point, and now finally it's time for me to rank them and tell you what I think as I have gone through each of them. However, I have to add a really important caveat, and that is that I enjoyed all of these. There's not a single one of these books that I came away thinking like, I hated that book. There are some that there were certainly things I found more challenging. There are some that it wasn't exactly my style, but there were still certainly things that I enjoyed. So before I jump into this and I lead people to think that the first ones on this list are terrible books, I actually should tell you a little bit about my methodology, and it's pretty simple. I take 2 books. I say, of these 2 books, which one am I more likely to recommend to friends? And I say that loosely. That is taking into consideration what are friends interested in. I have some friends that it doesn't matter how much I enjoyed a book. If it's just not a topic that's going to interest them, because that's not the type of thing that they read, then, obviously that's not going to be a great suggestion. But it still counts pretty highly in my book if it is something that I enjoyed a great deal, and even if it's going to be person specific, that I would want to tailor that recommendation for. And if it's a book that I would struggle to recommend to someone, again, not because it was a bad book, but because I just don't know who that would appeal to. The audience might be a little too narrow, or when I just think about my especially literary friends, which ones I think are already familiar with this book or have no idea about this book. And I use that kind of as just a measuring stick. So again, I just take each book, put them up against each other, and then I build out my list. So let's get into it. This is very exciting. This is also not scripted. Most of my other videos I have scripted. I've thought about what I've wanted to say, and I've written it out. So this right here, I've just gone through and ranked the 19 books, and if I can remember, I'll tell you what each of the books is, what category it belongs to. There's some confusion. Some are pretty obvious. If it's fiction, then you know it's the fiction category. If it's a book of poems, you know it's the book of poems. Sometimes history and biography, those can kind of blend together. And so I'll try to remember which ones are which. But let's take a look. So I will tell you now that one of my favorite things about reading all these books every year are the ones that just take me to ideas and a whole genres that I'm just not even really familiar with. That being said, it's still hard to recommend those books. So probably the category that gets the most punished in this list, just because it's a category it's hard for me to share with people, would be the poetries. And that is because I just don't know many people that are all that interested in contemporary poetry. That being said, I really enjoy these books, and I love that it's a chance for me to dig into some of the most well-regarded books on poetry that are coming out each year, even if I'm not someone that is heavily involved in that scene, and so I don't know individuals I could recommend these books to, but they are going to be low on the list, and I apologize for that. If you are a big fan of contemporary poetry, just know that I did enjoy it, and the only reason why they tend to be low on my list is just because it's not something that I'm going to be quick to recommend to people. But let's jump into the list. At number 19 is, of course, a selection of poems by Jennifer Chang called An Authentic Life. I did enjoy this. The reason why it is lowest on the list, though, is one, because it is a book of poetry, and two, because there were quite a few elements of this collection of poems that I didn't quite connect with. It did have some wonderful poems that I did easily connect with. Then there were some that I had a hard time really getting fully invested in or fully understanding exactly what the individual was referring to. And so that's one of the reasons why this is lowest on the list. And again, it's still a wonderful collection of poems, but of all the 19 books I read, it is probably the one that I'm least likely to recommend to anyone or to probably read again. And next on the list at number 18 is Until I Find You by Rachel Nolan. This one dealt with the forcing of adopting children that came from usually pretty poor situations, but there's actually a fair amount of debate of just how much coercion was involved in putting these children up for adoption, especially on the international stage. And I found this a very compelling read. The reason why it scored so low is because it was one of these books that was also just hard for me to read. The idea of children that were being taken away from their family, and in many cases it was not the desire of the parents for that, and I struggled with it. That, again, does not mean it's a bad book. It just means it's a book I'm not likely to recommend to people, but I do think that the story it was telling was incredibly important, and I certainly appreciated that element of it. But you know, the subject matter is just going to make it a little harder for me to recommend to people. But again, it is an absolutely compelling story and something worth considering. If you have more questions in the legacy of that forced adoption, this only follows one country, as I recall. I want to say it was Guatemala, but you actually can find this in lots of different places, especially anywhere that's had any major issues with civil war or just long-term instability. They frequently are targets for this type of forced adoption. At number 17 is Bluff by Danez Smith. This was another collection of poems, and again, I really enjoyed parts of these poems. The author is a fascinating character, and the author has a lot of really powerful things to say, and also there's still a lot that I just didn't fully engage with. This is one of those collections of poems where it is really important to see the visual representations of it. There is a lot that the author puts into the design, and I did enjoy that. But again, there are quite a few poems in there as well that I just was like, ooh, that's a little too graphic for me, especially again in terms of recommending it to people. That's going to be a common theme if you don't know me, that it's kind of hard for me to recommend things that are going to be overly graphic, just because the people that I interact with, that's not usually going to be something that they're interested in. But that's why it's going to be down at number 17 for me. At number 16, we have I Heard Her Call My Name by Lucy Sante. This is one of the autobiographies, and again, I've said this before, I struggle with autobiographies and memoirs, and this book is one of the reasons that really encapsulates why. I don't know Lucy Sante as an author. She was a well-known author before this book even, and this is a book that details her transition from a man to a woman, and I actually wanted to be more interested in that. The problem was, I think there was a lot of discussion about Lucy Sante's life in a way that, again, I wasn't familiar with it. I think because Lucy Sante was an established author in a literary scene, I believe in New York, there was a ton of discussion about life in New York. And guess what? I don't live in New York, so it is really hard for me to connect with that. Now, a lot of the discussion about the process of transitioning and talking to friends about it, I did find that really compelling. And that was the main purpose in this author writing this book. Matter of fact, it wasn't the physical transformation that the author was most interested in. The author was most interested in discussing how friends reacted to her coming out as trans woman, and then, of course, the actual process of transitioning physically. And so I certainly found that a very powerful story to tell, but I also thought that there were significant points of connection that I just couldn't really connect with the author, and I thought that if maybe I was better familiar with the author before this book, I may have been able to appreciate the book more. This is actually one of the books that I read last year because it was getting some hype from last year, and I'm sorry, Lucy Sante, it's nothing against you personally, but again, I just am very suspicious of most memoirs and autobiographies, and this was one that fell in that category. Again, totally worth the read if this sounds like something that would interest you, but also, me personally, there were a few points where I just couldn't quite connect the way that I wanted to. Then coming in at number 15 is Marie Howe, New and Selected Poems. Again, another collection of poems. This actually won it, and this was my favorite of the collections of poems. I think because it was a diversity of collections, so both some new ones that she'd just written, but also some that were great representations of stuff that she'd written over the years, and I loved it. There were some very powerful poems that talked about the everyday challenges of life. I found so much, but also dealing with like profound loss. There was a lot to really relish in there, and I really did appreciate this collection of poems. Again, though, I just am not in a hurry to recommend collections of poems to friends because I don't have many friends that that's what they want, at least not in my recommendation. So that's why it is unfortunately down at 15. At number 14, we have Mice, 1961. This was a really interesting read. It is one of the fiction books, one of the finalists. So like I said, there was one winner and three finalists, and it was a bizarre and wonderful and crazy thing to read, but it is very nonlinear in its approach. It deals with all sorts of challenges. First of all, it's happening in Miami during the Cuban Missile Crisis, but there's also so much more in taking place in this neighborhood, and it switches just between perspectives, and there's a lot going on, and it's fun to read in some respects. It is very challenging to read in some respects. And because it is so experimental in its approach, again, I'm not in a hurry to recommend it. If I'm going to read an experimental book like this, and I enjoy it, that's great. But it really has to stand out in a way that I feel like my friends that don't read experimental novels like this are going to have a new appreciation for experimental approaches. And it didn't quite do that for me. So again, that's why it's going to be down at 14. It's just a little hard for me to recommend it for people that it's a little too experimental for most people, but it certainly is an engaging read. At number 13, The World She Edited by Amy Reading, and this is actually about Catherine White, who was the wife of E.B. White. So she had a famous husband, but she herself was also a huge player in the literary scene in the mid 20th century, as she was one of the most important editors with the New Yorker magazine, and because she herself was one of few women in such an important position, she went on to represent lots of things. So represented working women, represented women that really helped to shape the taste of Americans. And I found this book to be incredibly well written. It was a little long for my taste, and again, I'm going to come back to this again and again, and that is that it was just a little too New York centric in my taste, and that became pretty obvious right away. I certainly found the individual that was being written about to be an interesting person, but there was just a little too much focus on a very insular and a very specific culture of the literary elites of the 1950s, and there can be plenty that I could enjoy about that, but there's also just too much written about it already. And so it makes it hard for me to love this book, but it is well written, and it is definitely something worth looking into if you think you have any interest in that time period or that group of people, or her husband. E.B. White, I think, is an endlessly fascinating character. The books that he brought us would not seem to match the type of person he was. If you think of those children's classics, but also on style, all those things are just makes him a very interesting character. And I do think that this biography of her gives you a glimpse into that, but it also dealing with a very distinct individual from her husband. So you can see why there'd be much to appreciate, but again, you can also see why I, as an individual that is just not in love with that time and place, is only going to have a limited ability to appreciate that. At number 12, I have To the Success of Our Hopeless Cause. This is by Benjamin Nathans. This deals with, especially in Eastern Europe, a lot of the efforts at resistance to Soviet rule. There's a lot of different things it talks about. I actually reviewed another book earlier this year that was the CIA book club that dealt with a lot of the same things, and just absolutely fascinating things to read about. However, I will say that it is very deep in details, and it does deal with a lot of terminology and concepts you may not be familiar with. And even though you think you might know a lot about, say, Soviet history, you're not going to recognize like almost any of the names in this book, and there's going to be a lot of them. And that's one of the things that makes it just a little more challenging to read. Also, I did structurally have some issues that I just couldn't quite catch on to. I think it was because they were striving to be narrative, but they also jumped between the things that they were talking about, and so trying to stick to chronology was just a little bit of a challenge. But if you can get through that, it is a great read. But those were just some of the things that brought it down just a little bit for me. Number 11, we have Fee by Alexandra Fuller. This is another memoir, one that I actually wasn't so sure I would love, especially since it's mostly about the author losing her adult son. That being said, I did actually think this was incredibly well written. and I did connect with the author. There are certainly some things that I don't think everyone's going to connect with. She makes a few choices about trying to deal with her grief that I think some people might find questionable, especially if you don't have her disposition. But I thought that the conversation that she was trying to have, and admitting the challenges that there are in losing a child, even though it was an adult child, he was still quite young, I believe in his 20s, and so it is going to detail everything that she does to try and cope with that. And obviously, in the end, she cannot take away the pain that comes with that, but she does find ways to discuss it and to open up about it with people. And I did find it a much more interesting read than I expected. That's probably one of the reasons why it was higher on the list, even though it is a memoir. At number 10, you have I Am on the Hit List by Rollo Romig. This was one of the books I was most excited to read when I first went through the list. It talks about a journalist in India, mostly fighting against the Hindu Nationalist Party that has not only taken control in India over the last decade or so, it has done so in many cases in pretty brutal fashion, although not necessarily in a fully systematic way. And so that's one of the things that this journalist was trying to detail. And her murder is a fair representation of the physical violence that is coming at the behest in some ways, or at least whether overtly stated, at the very least the clear desire of the ruling party that this gets tamped down somehow. And so she's going to be one of the journalists that is going to eventually be killed because of her outspokenness against the ruling Hindu Nationalist Party in India. I don't know why I put it at 10. I did find it a fascinating read, and I would recommend this to most people that would like to understand the situation a little better. Maybe that was maybe why I didn't put it quite so high. I did think the author did his best at giving a larger context, but I did think that this was maybe just a little too narrowed in on this single journalist. And so sometimes it's hard to fully appreciate the full picture, especially in a country as big and as complicated and as diverse as India, to use this one small example to make the case for a larger systemic problem of persecution of people that don't share the ideology of the ruling party. I think I maybe just had a slight disparity between this one person's experience and the tragic death that they faced, and a better understanding of just the scale and scope of the problem as a whole. And I think that's probably the one thing that I was hoping to just get a slightly better understanding by the time I finished, and it just wasn't quite there. At number 9, we have Headshot by Rita Bullwinkel. This is one of the novels. Again, you had 3 finalists that were not the winners, and this was so interesting. This is a novel that takes place over it's just a weekend, and it's a boxing tournament, and I don't even remember where it takes place, but Nevada or somewhere. Anyways, but the point is that you have all these different girls that are into boxing. They all have completely different reasons. Some have very tragic pasts. Some of them are just they're just there to fight because that's just part of what's going on in their families, and there's just so many interesting things going on in the stories that are being told. And you also are not only having flashbacks of what's going on in their lives, but you're also having some, jump forwards to see what exactly happens from these individuals. And in many cases, this very important weekend where they're participating in what could seem like an important tournament doesn't really mean all that much in the end, because their lives go in completely different directions. But this one weekend still could have some impact on it, whether you realize it or not. And it was just a really fun and interesting read. And I shouldn't say fun. It's a very engaging read, because, like I said, many of these individuals have quite tragic pasts. But there's the style, the rhythm, I'm not someone that loves boxing or MMA fighting or anything like that, but I certainly did enjoy just the author's approach to the methodic engagement between 2 people who are bringing everything into the ring, and yet at the same time it's still just those individuals with their boxing gloves, and whoever has the most desire to win, coupled with the actual skill, but also random things like height and all that play an impact into whether you're going to win or not. And I did find it just a really engrossing way of depicting that weekend's tournament, and it was certainly something that I enjoyed, hence why it's made it into the top half of my list. At number 8, we have Feeding Ghosts by Tessa Holes. This is a graphic memoir. I thought this was so intriguing. However, if you've seen my video on it, you know that there were a few things that I tried not to judge it too harshly, because I did enjoy reading it. However, it was a little too long for me, and I think I was giving it a little too much hype, because there are other books similar to this that I love, like Persepolis, and maybe I was just expecting a little too much. But that being said, It is a good book. It's a great book. It was also the last book I could finally finish because, I couldn't easily get a copy of it. I think because it was so long and because it was so visual, it seemed to be anywhere that did have a copy of it, whether it was an ebook or an actual physical copy of it, they had to keep it checked out to the very limits of that due date. And so it took me several tries to finally finish it, but I did. I found this a fascinating read. Tessa Holes herself has had a pretty interesting life, but going back and looking back at her mother's life and her grandmother's life, especially as they were leaving communist China and going to Hong Kong and then coming to the United States, you just see all these different stages of cultural miscommunication, cultural expectations, and just challenges that are just building and growing. And I think that Tessa Hall does an excellent job at some beautiful pictures, but also some really terrifying pictures, which I think is the purpose as she is trying to get across her just the feelings of inadequacy or the feelings of frustration that she has with her mother and her grandmother. And it's a great read. Just know that it is long and you may have a hard time getting a hold of it for that reason. At number 7, we have James. James was actually the winner of the novel section, the fiction section, and this was one of the most lauded books of 2024. I've already done a review on it. I did a review back when I first heard about it in 2024. I loved this book. I thought it was great. Like I said in my review, I didn't love elements of the very ending of it, but pretty much everything else, I just found it totally engaging. The whole premise of rewriting a classic like Huckleberry Finn, which is already a book I adore, but it's also just tinged with its legacy and its time and place, and I think rightfully so. I think that, that's something that we should always take into consideration, but I also think that this does an excellent job at forcing us to have a whole new conversation about that book, and I loved it, and I thought it was incredibly well done, and I thought that Percival Everett really deserved pretty much all the praise that he got. And so that's why I put it at 7. You may notice that that is not the highest in the fiction category. I do have one other book we'll get to in a second that I actually preferred more, but maybe it's just because I came to that one more recently, more freshly, and James I read last year when it was getting all the hype that it was getting. At number 6, we have Plantation Goods. This was, just an absolutely enthralling read. This was a book that took a look at all of the different things that plantations bought in relation to slavery. So whether it was the clothes, whether it was the whips that were used to force individuals to do the work that they wanted them to do, or whether it was other resources that were being used to house or help the enslaved laborers in some way. I thought it was such a fresh and new way to look at something that is so influential and so impactful on the history of the United States, but also to force us to look at it a completely different way. So in some ways, it's all part and parcel. The whole reason for slavery was for economic reasons. You have all sorts of justifications that go beyond solely economic reasons, but it was really for economic purposes. And Plantation Goods says, well, let's take that conversation and let's extend it. Let's look at other material reasons related to the practice of slavery and see how the statistics, the numbers, the ledgers, all of that bears out when we take a broad look at it. So engaging. I thought it was a fascinating read, and I certainly thought that it shined a light on a pretty well-known topic in American history, but it just did it in a new way and in an interesting way. And for that reason, it made it all the way up to 6 for me. I certainly would recommend this to pretty much anyone that is curious. It is a pretty academic book, I will say that, and it is published, I'm pretty sure, by an academic press. Quite a few of these were. So it's not going to be fully accessible to everyone. And because it does deal a lot with archival information, there is a lot of tables and just discussions of numbers in a way that not everyone is going to be drawn in with. So that is why it got down at number 6 for me. But if you are willing to deal with those charts and those tables, it's such an interesting read. At number 5, this is my highest rated fiction book, and that is Unicorn Woman by Gayl Jones. I loved this book. I don't even know how to explain it. Please just go watch my review. This was easily my favorite of the fiction books. And like I already said, maybe I ranked this higher than James just because I did read it more recently. But it was just the writing styles and very impressive. Gayl Jones herself has a peculiar life. I don't know, peculiar strong enough. She's had a challenging, but also just a very involved life, and she had stepped away for decades from writing. This is one of her first books back. I think she had one other before this, but she had decades of not being involved, and I thought this book was so well written, and it similar to pretty much any other book in this category. Don't expect a simple telling of a story. Don't expect a normal narrative arc, but do come in ready to enjoy the language being used, the attitude. There's a certain element of both swagger, but also in some ways, I don't want to say humility, but certainly awareness that I just think that it makes it a wonderful read for a variety of reasons. At number 4, we have Combee. This was one of the books I was most excited to read. This tells the story of Harriet Tubman and a famous raid that she led. Harriet Tubman, who's of course already famous for so many other reasons, most notably being a conductor on the Underground Railroad, but she had a fascinating life even after that. During the Civil War, she served as a spy, and then this right here is probably one of the most interesting moments in her life that there's just not a lot of information about. So I was very excited to read this, and I did enjoy this book. I will say this though. Similar to Plantation Goods, there's a lot of archival evidence. So we don't have a ton of narrative stories to go off of to piece together this incredible raid. So you're going to have a lot of looking at census data or, again, ledgers and just a bunch of different things to tell a story. So that is one reason why it got a little ding for me in terms of telling the story. But that's life. That is how we tell stories as historians. We have to use those sources that we have. And so that was one of the problems. I think that's one of the reasons why this was not such a well-known element in American history, especially in Harriet Tubman's life, is because I just think that we didn't have a great telling of it from her perspective or from the other individuals that were involved in the raid. But it's still a wonderful read. I highly recommend it. At number 3, we have Native Nations by Kathleen Duvall. I love this book. First of all, I reviewed a book last year, The Rediscovery of American History by Ned Blackhawk, that is in a similar vein, where it's saying, you know, I don't know exactly how you know Native American history, but let's take a whole new look at it. Let's refocus Native American history in the telling of American history. Instead of making it a peripheral part, let's explore it from it being the primary viewpoint of American history. Native Nations does a wonderful job of doing that too. And this does not have the same issues of some of the other history books I've talked about, where the sources that we have that are all archival and very data driven. This is actually going to rely on a wide variety of sources that are going to be very engaging, very enthralling. And it does take you all over the United States. So there's going to be moments that you're looking at the Pacific Northwest. There's moments that you're going to be looking at the Eastern Appalachian Native American tribes or the Mississippian tribes. So there's a lot of different things that you're going to take in as you read through this book. And it is enthralling. I loved it. I'm so glad that there are new types of histories being written about American history that give people additional perspectives. That's our job as historians. And I love this one, especially in connection with the other one that I reviewed just last year. I think they're coming out of very similar veins, although I do talk about the differences. So please go watch that review if you're curious about either of those. And then one that I knew I would love at number 2 is going to be John Lewis by David Greenberg. I have long since respected John Lewis ever since I heard his nickname as the Conscience of the Congress. I knew that this was a biography I would enjoy reading, and sure enough, I loved it. John Lewis was a fascinating character, and by the end of his life, he was just a mountain of a man in terms of the legacy that he brought to fighting injustice, to being involved in the civil rights movement, and then even while he was in Congress, he was, I would say in many respects, I mean, he's still a politician, but you could see elements of him being more than a politician, being an actual statesman at times, and that all shone through in this book. I loved it. I knew that I would enjoy this book. And last year, my top book from all of the Pulitzer Prizes was the biography of Martin Luther King Jr. And so I can see a recurring trend here, but I can't change the fact that I really did enjoy this. And this is going to be one of the top books that I would recommend for anyone that wants a suggestion from any of the Pulitzer Prize finalists or winners. This is going to be up there. I loved it. Fantastic book. Last and not least, actually definitely not least, I don't know if I'd say it's my biggest surprise, but it's certainly the one that I didn't know about for sure going into it, and by the time I finished it, I loved it. And that would be Every Living Thing by Jason Roberts. I'm such a sucker for these types of books apparently, and this is a book about scientists, because scientists push the world forward in so many ways. But what's interesting is exploring their lives and understanding why they come up with the theories or the contributions to science that they do and the way that they do it. And so this one explores two particularly noteworthy scientists, Carl Linnaeus and Buffon. Sorry, I don't remember his entire name, but these are two major scientists that are essentially trying to catalog all of the organisms in the world. And so Linnaeus is famous for coming up with the binomial system. So many people are probably more familiar with the name Linnaeus, but Buffon actually has a lot of approaches that are all encompassing. They're a little more flexible in terms of dealing with just how much diversity there is in organisms, and also why things don't always fit into these very simple categories that Carl Linnaeus was very adamant about. And it's so engrossing. First of all, they led very interesting lives themselves, but also bringing to life the time and period in which they were writing. That was just so well done. And I loved it. And I think one of the reasons why it is my #1 book of the Pulitzer Prize winners and finalists is because it was one that when I read the description, I thought that's probably interesting. But until I read it, I didn't know how much I would love it. And when I did read it, I was like, this is a book I could easily read again. And this is a book I can easily recommend to friends. And that is why it is my #1 choice of all of these books. Of course, I would love to know what you guys are thinking about these books. And you, of course, can go see my reviews for all of them. Like I said, all 19, they have their own reviews. And if any of them sound interesting, please go check them out and let me know what you're thinking. I would love to know what you guys are thinking about this list. Which ones would you put in a different order? Which ones would you keep in the more or less in the same order? Or maybe you have a completely different approach to how you'd order them. Please let me know in the comments. I would love to know. And while you're here, please go check out more reviews, whether it is one of these 19 books that I have reviewed in the last year, or whether it is one of my other categories. I, of course, have my Great Courses series that I have done a fair amount of reviews on, or the Very Short Introduction. Not everything I do is going to be nonfiction. I have the fantasy series that I review. Please go find something that interests you, watch it, and let me know your thoughts on that same book. That's the reason I make this channel. And if you're enjoying my videos, please share them. The more people that know about my channel, the more videos I can make. And don't forget to like, subscribe, turn on those notifications. And until next time, keep those pages turning.